All right, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm Eric Kimberling here with Paresa. Be sure to follow us on social media. Follow Third Stage or myself, Eric Kimberling, on LinkedIn. That's where we're most active. You can also find us both on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So, Paresa, we had this conversation with Dave about the SAP digital transformation gone wrong and how it got right again. What were some of the observations you had from the discussion?
Yeah, well, a lot of the discussion, well, a lot of the problem seems like it happened in the testing phase, which is interesting because, you think when you're testing, you're going to be in the clear of any trouble if you pass the test. But if your tests aren't mirroring that reality of the situation, obviously it's not going to work as you intended it to work. And one thing that Dave specifically said was make sure to do end-to-end testing. So it might be an amateur hour question, but I do I do hope to kind of dissect that. How would you explain end-to-end testing in layman's terms?
Sure. So that's where you have a couple different types of testing. You have the technical testing, the unit testing is what developers or software people usually call it, where you're testing a certain function in a system. Like I want to create a purchase order. And so they'll test that one little piece of the software. And then another one might be approval of a purchase order or approval of an invoice. And you're testing each of those things individually as you configure it. And if you do customization or any code behind it, you're testing those individual pieces. End-to-end testing is when you put it all together and you say, okay, now we're going to take a whole workflow from start to finish, from the time a customer places an order, or even before then, a potential customer becomes a prospect. How do we sell to them? How do we provide estimates or bids to them? How do we close the deal or create an order? How does it flow through the entire process? So it's meant to draw out defects or issues or challenges or things that need to be addressed in the processes and workflows. And on one hand, it's common to run into challenges. That's why you do end-to-end testing, because you want to work out the kinks in a non-real life environment, so to speak, where the stakes are lower. You're not screwing up a customer order for real. You're testing it, and you're screwing it up in a test environment. So you want to, on one hand, you want to break as much as you can during that end-to-end testing. But on the other hand, a lot of organizations find that they haven't done enough of the legwork up front, and now when you get to end-to-end testing, that's when everything falls apart, because you realize that this is more than just fixing some minor wrinkles here and there. This is a mass problem that we have, and that's a sign typically of mismanagement of the project earlier on, because you should have wrinkles you're working out again, but you don't want to have a massive problem where it's a showstopper where this just isn't going to work at all. If you've gotten to that point in end-to-end testing, that's a problem. So back to your question, that end-to-end testing is more of it's both technical in nature in terms of you're trying to find kinks in the system, but you're also trying to find kinks in the operational alignment with the technology. So in other words, is this going to work from a business perspective? And oftentimes clients or consultants will refer to that as conference room pilots, which is another form of end-to-end testing where it's more focused on the business workflows, not just the technology.
I see. Okay. So it's just kind of getting a full scope of what the new technology will do rather than testing pieces.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. The technology and the processes. It's also making sure that we've defined what's Paresa going to do in this workflow. What am I going to do? What's that handoff look like when I pass something back to you in the system or whatever? It's meant to not only work out the technical kinks, but also the operational and organizational kinks as well.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And then the other thing that Dave mentioned is that it sounded like there was more so the managers who were testing, and maybe it wasn't exactly the right people who were doing the testing, like the people who would actually be utilizing the software day to day, kind of like working on the front line. So I guess my question to you, and we've touched on this before, but what is an ideal project team? I mean, in an ideal world, would you have one large team working on the group, and then within that team, it branches off into like the steering committee, the OCM team, the testing team, etc. Have you seen that happen, or what's the best practice as far as how to build your project team?
Yeah, so generally you'd have, you mentioned a couple of them. Steering committee would be the executive steering committee, which is, your executive team, and they're the ones that everything, they're kind of the point where the buck stops there. I mean, any major decisions that need to be made or any major issues that need to be worked through, they're more strategic in nature. Generally, that's what they're for, is to provide that point of escalation, as well as obviously, keeping them informed of what the changes are, the impact of the organization, and making sure the team stays aligned at the executive level. Then you usually have a project manager, a project lead, or program manager, I should say, who manages all the internal resources, the system integrator, the other third parties, the change management team. All the stuff reports up to the program manager, and then below that, you typically would have the core project team, which is usually a smaller group of. It depends on the size of the organization, the size of the team, but a lot of times it'll be 7 to 10 people. They're part of this core team where they're the core, they're the continuity through the project as far as defining big picture operational workflows and organizational impacts, or helping identify organizational impacts, and they sort of own the change, if you will. But then below that, you'd have a series of subject matter experts that you draw in as needed. So that's where you get a lot more people involved potentially, and you go deeper into certain areas as you get into accounts payable or accounts receivable or procurement or whatever the case may be. You'll bring in subject matter experts for some of the different sub-processes, and their job is usually to provide the subject matter knowledge so that we can build a workflow and a technology to support the new business processes. But they're also the ones that would be involved in the end-to-end testing or the conference room pilots that we were talking about a minute ago. They'd be the ones oftentimes that would help with the training, so going out and helping train the other people. They end up being sort of the super users or people that are experts in the system. So there's a whole nother layer of subject matter experts that can provide additional involvement and knowledge to the process as well.
That makes sense. I mean, this is especially for larger companies where they're doing a total uphaul of their systems. I mean, being more collaborative sounds like the right thing to do, but then also you don't want to get too many people involved, because then it's almost like you're diluting the process. So, okay, at a high level, to test things correctly, because this sounded like the biggest issue that they ran into. Make sure you do end-to-end testing, and make sure you have the right people who are testing. Do you have any other best practices that you'd share when it comes to testing your software before go live?
Yeah, I would actually bring it further upstream, even way before the actual testing, because like I said, that testing oftentimes will expose, call it the normal kinks that need to be worked out, but then oftentimes it exposes big problems you should have worked out a lot earlier. And so the question becomes, how do we take some of that stuff off the table or deal with that stuff earlier? Because by the time you get to testing, usually it's later in the project, and it's harder to get it back on track by the time you get to testing. It's kind of like same thing with training. A lot of times when you get to training, people start to freak out, and you realize that organizationally roles aren't defined very well as far as what this is going to look like in the future, and then you're scrambling trying to figure out how we're going to clarify all this for people. In addition to training them, now we have to figure out who's doing what and how we're going to set up security in the new system to accommodate new user profiles and whatnot. So I think with end-to-end testing, we have to look at how do we get a handle on those business processes and workflows to really work out the kinks, at least conceptually early on, so that, Dave was talking about the units of measure issue that they had with converting to barrels. I think he was saying, like, because they're taking liquids, putting them in barrels. So that's a unit of measure conversion type of issue when you've got one barrel, and you've got to determine what is one barrel equal in terms of ounces or gallons of other materials. So that's something that should have been worked through earlier. I mean, that's something that you would define in a workflow when you're modeling out how it's going to look and the design of the system. So that was a flaw. I don't know how that happened or why that happened, but something got missed. But that's pretty major early on. So I think that the key is to really look up front. If you take the time up front to define your processes at a high level at least, and use that as a blueprint to how you want the system integrator or the software vendor to implement the technology, usually that's going to be a lot more effective, and it's going to draw out some of these kinks early in the process. You can deal with them head on and have a better solution to deal with them rather than waiting till testing or even end user training to discover some of those.
Right. I mean, it sounds like the success of a digital transformation is honestly front loaded. It's what you do at the beginning, how you set yourself up, that will determine how you cross the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we always tell clients too that, don't just jump into an implementation once you've selected the software, the technology. Don't just jump in and start building stuff, because that's what a lot of system integrators will encourage you to do. Because you think about it, that they're incentivized to get on site as quickly as possible and just start doing stuff because the meter starts running and they're busy, they're making money, all that good stuff. But as far as what you need for your business to be successful, you want to take the time up front before you ever engage or bring in the system integrator to clearly define what should this business process look like at the end of the day. We're not getting down into workflows and which buttons do we push, what screen do we go to. We're not getting down to the really granular detail, but at least have that general flow so that you can own the project and use that as a blueprint to guide and direct the system integrator to build, to meet that accordingly. If you don't do that, then you end up building bits and pieces of the technology, and then you get to end-to-end testing and realize this doesn't fit together the way we wanted it to for our business. So that's an important takeaway as well.
Yeah, and speaking of finding the right fit, Dave specifically mentioned is one of his tips, find the right cultural fit. So I'm curious on that because I've never thought of a technology or software as having a culture per se. So I guess, what should leaders be looking for if they want to take that tip to the bank? How do you align your company culture with the culture of a software or a software vendor?
Yeah, it's an interesting nuance. It's definitely more of an art than a science. It's hard to quantify, but it's just to give an example. It's probably the best way I could describe it, or give a couple examples. You have, for big companies, a lot of times big companies will consider SAP versus Oracle, and those are two systems that are very different. SAP is a lot more structured and rigid, and some would argue inflexible compared to Oracle. Oracle's more, it just has more flexibility. It's easier to integrate with other third-party systems. They both have pros and cons. I mean, neither one of those is right or wrong, even though some may have a strong preference, but there are definite pros and cons. So you want to look at which one of those is going to fit not only who we are today, but what we want to be. A lot of companies that have grown and scaled decide that we're acting in too many silos, and we're acting very disparate. We're not integrated in terms of our workflows and data. So something like an SAP could help us get there. Other customers might say, well, we're trying to retain flexibility. We have all different types of customers throughout the world we're trying to accommodate, and flexibility is part of our model. SAP probably isn't going to fit very well there, or it could create some conflict there. That's where an Oracle might fit better. And for a smaller mid-market company, the same holds true for, say, Oracle NetSuite is, kind of the more standard, more rigid version for the smaller companies. And then you've got something like an Odoo that's an open source system that you can change and do whatever you want with it. So two totally different cultural fits, if you will, but that's the kind of thing you have to look at. And you have to do it in the context of where you are today and then what you're trying to nudge the company to become in the future.
Right, future state. We talk a lot about that. What is your company or your organization going to look like in 5, 10, 20 years? And how can the software help you get there? That makes sense.
Yeah. So it's all part of getting the right technology up front. I think in this case the client did choose the right technology. I don't think it was necessarily a problem that SAP wasn't a good fit. That unit of measure thing is a common challenge for a lot of different companies and a lot of different systems. So if you're if you happen to be working for a company that makes food or beverage or any other sort of process manufacturing, chemicals, for example, unit of measure where you're converting something that's liquid into single units, that conversion is very difficult for a lot of systems. So you have to look at things like that. What are those big deal breakers or things that could create challenges in your operations? So some good takeaways from Dave, and we appreciate having him on the show.